Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm reviewing the new album from Chvrches, Love Is Dead. Chvrches are a group that, in the past, I've enjoyed some of their material, particularly some tracks that they've had on their past couple of albums I found myself enjoying. However, I never really found myself being a massive fan of those albums as a whole. I really couldn't connect with them for the most part in just the album format, and for the most part I really just stuck with some songs here or there on both albums that I happened to enjoy for the most part when it came to me, returning to the band to re-listen to some of their material, or things of that sort after, hearing those albums initially. So going into this album, I was a bit concerned that the same thing would really happen here. However, at the same time, I hoped that maybe the band would be able to deliver a full-length album that I'd be able to enjoy from start to end, or for the most part, most of the album at least, that I'd be able to enjoy. And out of all the tracks that were released ahead of the album as singles, the only one I happened to hear was Get Out, and however, I really liked that song. I thought it was a really great track, and it still is one of my favorite cuts on this album. I think it's a pretty catchy track through and through. I think the vocals on it are pretty great. It's overall just a very solid song, and it's a very catchy one as well. A pretty fun track, and it's pretty good overall, I'd say. Now that I've heard the entire product, the entire album, the full thing, really, this thing didn't really do much for me overall. I feel like this definitely falls under the same category as their last albums that they've released that were also very hit or miss for me in terms of the song quality, though I think this one here has more misses than hits for sure. I think it's definitely the weakest of the three albums that they've released so far. There are some good moments on it, however, which I'm going to start with talking about those. Aside from Get Out, which I mentioned earlier, the opening track, Graffiti, is another pretty good one in my opinion. I think the vocals on this track are pretty great through and through. It's overall just a very strong track all around, and it's a great opener to the album. Especially when you consider that it is followed up by Get Out, which I mentioned before I also happen to really like. The start of this album is a pretty strong one, and immediately it hooked my attention, and I was really excited to see what this album was going to deliver. The track Graves later on in the track listing is another one that I happen to enjoy as well. That track, along with the first two, are probably my favorite three on the entire album. I think that they definitely have some replay value, at least for me. I think going forward I will replay these tracks. They're catchy, they're enjoyable, they're just synth-pop goodness pretty much, and that's kind of what I was hoping to get on the rest of this album as well, though I do feel like a lot of the rest of the album doesn't quite reach the same level of quality. And it's not really because anything on this album is downright awful or anything like that. It's just that there's not a lot on this album that's really great or super interesting as well. So much of this album feels very boring, very filler-like, and just uninteresting. The instrumentals for most of the tracks are pretty solid through and through. Like I said, there's not really a weak point, I would say, but some of them don't really stand out as being super interesting in comparison to some of the better tracks on here. They're just, they're just solid through and through, but not necessarily in like a good solid way, more as in, they're passable, I guess you could say. The vocals on this project are also pretty good throughout, but not, super good, I would say, either. And there are some moments that I think are, less interesting. One of the big weak points on the album, I feel, is the track God's Plan, which has one of the other members of the group stepping into the lead vocal roles, aside from their normal lead vocalist. And it's just a very boring, very uninteresting song. It just feels a bit all over the place, a bit aimless, just very hazy. Something that I feel like you could easily just put on and just forget that you're even listening to music. It's just a very uninteresting song in my opinion. And I'm kind of disappointed in the fact that they didn't take advantage of having multiple vocalists and having both, showcasing both on the same track, in a sense that doing it more than they actually did on this one song. Just having both of them, singing together on one track, I feel like would be a bit more interesting than kind of what they went with here, where they just take one of the other members of the band and give them the lead vocal role and kind of reduce the lead vocalist to background vocals. It just wasn't really interesting overall. I did get to hear their lead vocalist sharing the lead vocal roles with another vocalist on the track My Enemy. However, yet I still don't really feel like this track was all that interesting overall. It probably is one of the other better cuts on the album, but still it didn't really excite me all that much. Much of the tracks on here just don't really feel like they have all that much of a personality of their own to them. Much of the tracks on here kind of have the same personality as the other tracks. So when I'm listening to this thing through, it just kind of feels like one continuous song, really, at times, aside from the very strong points in here. And there are some moments on some of these tracks I also think are a bit stronger. There may be a cut on here with a very catchy chorus to it, but I don't really feel like the rest of the track clicks as much as it should. Or maybe one of the tracks has a better instrumental than the others, but the rest of the track isn't all that interesting either. There's too many moments on this album where I feel like things are just average for me to really enjoy this thing all the way through. You also get around a minute-long instrumental track that appears towards the end of this thing. I believe it's the second to last track, and it just really doesn't add anything to the album at all. It's one of the more forgettable instrumental filler tracks that I've heard on an album, which is saying something considering most of these types of tracks are filler to begin with. It could have easily been cut from the album and just would have saved you a minute of runtime that you wouldn't have been spent listening to this thing. And I'm not really sure why they had it, considering the album is, a good, acceptable length without it as well. It was just a waste of my time, honestly. So, overall, there's not really all too much I have to say about this project. I feel like I'm just repeating the same points, but then again, so many songs on this thing just feel very similar to me, and, the problems that they have are very similar to each other, just because they feel so samey. There's not really all too much I have to say regarding this thing. Pretty much the tracks I mentioned that I liked, I think are worth checking out if you're a fan of this group. And if you are a diehard fan of this group, chances are you're going to like this project to some extent, given that it doesn't exactly do all too much different from their previous releases. You'll probably like it to some extent. However, if you're like me and you weren't a big fan of those previous two albums, I'm guessing this album isn't going to do anything to really change your mind, but maybe you will enjoy a couple of the tracks on here like I did. So yeah, I think going forward I'm going to return to some of the cuts on here that I happen to really enjoy. However, a lot of the other cuts on here I feel like I'm going to forget in, not more than a couple of weeks, honestly, because they weren't super memorable. And, it's kind of disappointing for me, at least, considering I did have, slightly high hopes going into this thing, given when I heard Get Out, I really enjoyed that track, but it just didn't deliver overall, at least in my own opinion. But it is perfectly okay if you happen to enjoy this project or it did reach your level of expectations. In fact, if it did, leave it down in the comment section down below. I greatly appreciate seeing your opinion on this project. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on other future music-related content. Thank you for watching, guys, and stay golden.